Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Today we're going to be talking about the newest issue of the Wilson Quarterly, the Wilson Center's award-winning online magazine, with the help of its editor and two authors from the current issue. So first we'll welcome back to the program the editor of the WQ, Richard Byrne. Hi, Richard. Great to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here.
Well, welcoming you back is a sort of a tease of the title and the theme of the current issue, Back to the Future. Tell us about the theme and what the issue covers.
So when I was planning the issue, we knew that we would have to talk about either an incoming administration or a continuing administration. We had a few weeks of still trying to figure that out. But once it was determined that there would be an incoming Biden administration, we really decided that in a time of tumult and uncertainty, the temptation is to go back to the safe harbor of what's worked in the past, or as we'll talk about with one of our essayists, a concept that has become so ingrained and familiar that we almost can't discard it. So the essays in this particular issue really are about things that happened over the past 4 years, and in some cases over the past few decades, and what the prospects of reversing them, changing them, altering them for the better might be.
Great. It's a terrific issue, by the way. Of course, I've had the pleasure to read it. And you teased already, speaking of teases, our first guest, who is Alasdair Roberts. And Alasdair is a professor of public policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He also runs their School of Public Policy. And Alasdair's piece is titled The 100-Day Mistake, and it talks about what has become part of the conventional wisdom, part of the landscape, the idea of a president either getting off to a quick start during the first 100 days or not. Seems as if it's been around forever, but that's not the case, Alasdair. When did this come into being?
This 100-day benchmark really came into being, I think, in two phases. And the benchmark is basically the idea that a new president wants to go big and fast in the first 100 days of his presidency or her presidency, and in particular wants to have a broad legislative agenda, wants to get a lot of legislative successes in the first 100 days. And it goes back to 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president in March. He called an emergency session of Congress. Over the next 3 months, Congress passed 15 major laws that really restructured the way the American society and economy worked. And immediately after that, some folks began talking about the great successes of the 100 days, as they called it. But it really sort of became entrenched, I think, in the late 1950s when Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book, A History of the Roosevelt Administration. And in one of those volumes of his history really celebrated the 100 days. And that's when it became embedded in popular culture. And there have been many people who have written books or articles kind of going off the Schlesinger lead since then.
One of the things that you make clear in your piece is that, the mythology has a way of exaggerating things, and that FDR's first 100 days weren't exactly just a straight line of successes.
No, it was not an elegant process by any means. There were some legislative successes, but there were some pieces of legislation just that proved to be badly designed that had to be redone, some ideas that eventually got scrapped, some missteps, some oversights, things they didn't fix. I mean, everyone recognized that it was a national emergency, a very deep national economic crisis, that they had to move quickly. A lot of the work got done. It was sort of fast and dirty work.
Alasdair, one of the things that I was struck by greatly in editing the piece was the amazing history that is sort of the meat of the sandwich of the essay, in which you talk about how different presidents since Roosevelt have approached the 100 days. I think we'll park Kennedy for a moment because of the Schlesinger book. But can you talk a little bit about which presidents you think did anything useful with the concept?
Well, lots of presidents and their advisors have struggled with the concept. I think probably only Lyndon Johnson did a plausible job of actually matching what FDR got done in the 100 days. But many presidents have fallen short, or they have scrambled in an effort to kind of live up to the FDR legacy and have fallen short. And one of the points I make in the article is that this is just it's a bad way to think about strategy for new presidents.
Why does it persist? You're not the first to say it's a bad way, right? You mentioned others who've tried to talk their presidents out of it, and yet it continues. Why does it persist?
That's a really good question. Why, as you say, it's pervasive in political discourse today, right? Everybody assumes something big has got to happen in the first 100 days. Maybe there's sort of a political sense that political capital is at its greatest in the first 100 days, but that doesn't always follow. And, I think probably in all of us, there is this kind of desire, enthusiasm for a leader who's going to come in and go bold and fix all the mistakes quickly, bold, decisive action. But that's also a problematic concept, especially when you're running a country that is divided, that's polarized, where people have very different views about where the country should go.
Do you think an incoming president or an administration, because of course the decisions are made by a group of people, not a singular person, is this something that is just on the checklist that needs to be addressed? Has it become so ingrained in our thinking? And you make the point in your piece that it even has taken on an international dimension, that other countries have used this as a benchmark. Is it something that they must address because it's going to sit out there and people in the media like me are going to invoke the term? Is it unavoidable at this point?
So one strategy would be for a new administration to say, look, guys, this is a goofy benchmark. This is just the wrong way to think about it, right? I don't think that's a viable response these days, because the benchmark has become so deeply entrenched. And when you look at the major media, the coverage of the Biden administration, everybody has automatically gone to this. So what you see administrations trying to do is basically negotiate the benchmark or reinterpret the benchmark. So classically, it's about legislative achievements, right? It's the notion we're going to get a battery of major bills through Congress in the first 100 days. Interestingly, the Biden administration or the transition team for President-elect Biden in December set 3 benchmarks for the first 100 days. They were about 100 million vaccinations, encouraging the public to wear masks, and opening a majority of schools. And interestingly, that isn't principally about legislative change. That's basically about administrative action, working with states and local governments to change behavior and policy. So that's their attempt to basically say, this is how we want to be measured on the first 100 days. And implicitly, it's don't gauge our success in the first 100 days by how many major bills we got passed by April.
I would love to sort of build on that just a tiny bit. You mentioned that Biden has really been foregrounding executive actions. He's already been taken to task by the New York Times opinion page that, hey, ease up on that. One of the things that your essay really brings out is that presidents are actually legislatively constrained at times by the makeup of Congress, and in particularly in a very evenly divided Congress and Senate, such as we have right now. You're already seeing a move towards reconciliation and pushing through legislation. How big a deal do you think it is if nothing gets done in the first 100 days?
Well, I think
legislatively, yeah.
Yeah. So let me just back up. One key difference between today and FDR's day is that FDR had the advantage that the opposition had completely collapsed after the 1932 election. Many Republicans had endorsed, prominent Republicans had endorsed FDR. Senators and members of Congress on the Republican side said that they were basically willing to give him a blank check for a certain period of time. Obviously, we're in a very different world today. And the sort of point I make is that strategy has to be driven by circumstances. So what's the number one crisis that the country faces today? I mean, there are multiple crises, but the number one is pandemic, right? It's pandemic response. Some of that requires legislative action to back it up, but a large chunk of it is about implementation and about collaborating with states. It's about logistics. And that's if that's where the crisis is, that's where you should focus your attention. And if there isn't a battery of major legislation done within the first 100 days, then it's neither here nor there, really. It's a question of what are the immediate problems facing the country and how do you fix those problems?
It would seem in many ways that the utility of this gets actually worse as time moves on, because the pace of things is certainly so much quicker now than it was in 1933. And by setting expectations so high in a culture where yesterday's news occurs by noon of the same day, it doesn't even wait until the next day, this really puts a president in a precarious position as far as meeting or having any opportunity to meet expectations.
Well, that's right. It creates, I think, unreasonable expectations about what can get done or what can get done well. And I think the other point, I would go a little further and say it's just not ill-advised because it might lead to bad legislation. If you're in a country that is sharply divided, pushing a legislative agenda that favors one side, what I think I call in the article sort of a winner-take-all politics, can actually, I mean, because one of the other crises we've got right now is a crisis of division or a crisis of unity. Mm-hmm. And pushing an aggressive across-the-board legislative agenda might aggravate that crisis. So in a way, the 100-day benchmark might be exactly the wrong medicine for the times.
So I think that's one of the most intriguing things in your piece is you go on to talk about what is the formula for governing a deeply divided country. What is the formula? What would you recommend, or what does history or comparisons to other countries tell us works best?
So there was a historian, famous American historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, who actually won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1933, the same time that FDR came into office. And he wrote about sectionalism in American politics. And he basically said, here's the reality of American politics. It consists of big regions or sections, the North, the South, the Midwest, the West, that have very different cultures, political cultures, interests, and so on. And he said, you got to understand politics in Washington is sort of like politics in Europe. It's like diplomacy between the great nations. It's a whole bunch of peace treaties. And that was the way people thought about American politics for basically most of the period before FDR. After FDR, that kind of notion of American politics faded away. People thought that sectionalism was gone. My own argument would be that in a way, what we see is a return of sort of a kind of sectionalism. We're calling it polarization. But governing in a sectionalized or polarized society is different than governing in a society of, let's say, the 60s or 70s, where you think everybody is on the same page. It takes a lot more diplomacy, a lot more give and take, a lot more compromise. As I say in the article, it's about keeping the temperature below boiling point. You have to make a lot of compromises that you might not be entirely happy with, but you do it to keep the peace, right? You've got unity in the forefront of your mind. And my hunch is that that's the style of politics that will be necessary. And it is a different kind of mentality of politics, a different style than prevailed for most of the post-World War II period.
That's fast. That deserves its own discussion by itself. Terrific stuff. Thank you. But before we let you go, I do have to ask you, Richard says when he edited your piece, we could pretend he's not listening. How was it working with Richard as an editor?
Oh, it's great. Richard is a great editor. It was a lot of fun working with him.
Great. Alasdair, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciated seeing you today, and really a terrific piece.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So next up, we're going to turn our attention to a problem likely to persist well beyond the first 100 days, and that's the Iran nuclear deal. The article is called Reverse Engineering, and its author is Dalia Dassa Kaye. Dalia is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Middle East program, who served as a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and as the director of its Center for Middle East Public Policy. Dalia, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. So the incoming administration, like all administrations, it seems, talks about doing less in the Middle East and focusing elsewhere. Why is that unlikely to occur?
Well, there's a lot of fatigue with the Middle East after a decade of war, but the Middle East has a way of kind of creeping up on us, whether we like it or not. And the fact is that the region that the Biden administration is inheriting is really on the brink. We have ongoing regional wars that, the problems of the region don't stay in the region. We have continued refugee flows, humanitarian crises, and of course, the most pressing issue, which I think, which my article is about, which is the Iran nuclear issue, is front and center and likely to be the highest priority when it comes to the Middle East because of the urgency of the issue. Since the Trump administration withdrew from this deal in 2018, unfortunately, we have not gotten a better deal or better Iranian activity in the region. We've gotten a worse situation. And right now, Iran has actually resumed nuclear activity to levels that we saw before the 2015 agreement, which really prompted the international consensus to try to forge this agreement. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to focus.
Excuse me for stepping on your last word there, but I wanted you mentioned about the relative merits of the deal.
Yeah.
There's so much rhetoric that just goes to extremes. President Trump, for example, the worst deal ever, all this hyperbole. Could you give us a quick take on pluses and minuses, sort of a level-headed assessment of the deal versus the political rhetoric?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that this kind of national security issue got so politicized. I once heard a member of Congress kind of talk about it as the Obamacare of foreign policy. But it really is about containing a very dangerous nuclear capability. Right now, the Iranians have a civilian nuclear capability. The issue is about ensuring it doesn't have the ability to weaponize its program, which could lead to broader proliferation across the region. So this becomes not just a regional issue, but a global non-proliferation challenge. It would challenge the non-proliferation agreement. So the deal, in my assessment, was quite valuable. It wasn't perfect, but it contained the Iranian nuclear program. It didn't solve all of the regional issues, but it did put a lid on the program for at least a period of time. Some of the constraints were up to 10 years, some were up to 15, some were indefinite. And that was a net gain for the United States. Of course, it came with some costs. The region wasn't, didn't warmly embrace it. Iran's neighbors thought it actually emboldened the Iranians to more aggressive behavior. So, there are trade-offs, but generally speaking, it put the Iranian nuclear issue on the back burner for the time being. And in the initial stages, the Iranians were complying with it. So the basic trade of constrain Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relieving economic sanctions against Iran that were international because of this global concern. That was the core of the deal. And the International Atomic Energy Agency that oversaw the verification of this agreement basically, they issued reports again and again suggesting the Iranians were complying with the agreement. So in my assessment, it was a net gain. It certainly didn't solve all problems.
Dalia, one of the things that struck me the most in editing the entire issue, and with your piece in particular, is that this wasn't simply the Trump administration withdrawing from a bilateral deal or withdrawing from something like the Paris Accords that could easily be bought back into, and that there was a lot of internal pressure to do. Can you talk a little bit about what the global impact of this deal was, first in bringing together rivals in many cases, and also what the impact of the US withdrawal was?
Well, I think it was a very important point that this was a multilateral agreement. We often talk about the Iran nuclear deal, especially in the US domestic scene, as this US-Iran agreement, but it was an international agreement involving all members of the Security Council plus Germany with the Iranians. It was considered probably the biggest foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration. It was warmly embraced, not just by our close, European partners, but also supported by adversaries and global competitors like Russia and China. So there was broad global buy-in. The withdrawal really, and I think this gets to the cost benefit of the agreement. You can always argue, let's get a better deal. But the question is, if you're going to pull out of an agreement, what's the alternative? What do you replace it with? And that's what the Trump administration did not have an answer to. We did not understand what was the replacement. And our global, especially our close global partners in Europe, because withdrawing from the deal meant the reimposition of what's called secondary sanctions, which meant not only were we, not going to trade with Iran, that wasn't really part of the agreement. The lifting of sanctions that led to this deal were really about relieving the economic pressure on the rest of the world, so they could trade and invest with Iran, and Iran could export its oil, and that that would. There was hope that would moderate Iran, but ultimately the deal wasn't based on that hope. It was really a nuclear non-proliferation agreement. It was about, we've got to do this, so we put a lid on the program. Well, the problem with the secondary sanctions is that we punish not just our adversaries, but our allies. And they didn't take that well. There was a lot of friction in the transatlantic relationship because the Europeans worked very hard to strike this deal as well. And so in the end, the US was quite isolated. We saw it in the waning days of the Trump administration with the attempt to reinstate the arms embargo on Iran, on conventional arms. This would normally be a low-hanging fruit. There should be broad international consensus. Don't give Iranians more conventional arms. We couldn't even get that through the Security Council because there was so much frustration with the unilateral US approach. So I think it did cause some damage internationally, unfortunately.
Richard mentioned the relative ease at which the US is rejoining the Paris Accords, or not even dropping out completely in the first place. What would rejoining the JCPOA look like? Or JCPOA look like? Would we be welcomed back with open arms? Would Iran want new concessions? Would we have any credibility with our allies that we might not leave again? What would this look like?
Well, that's the big question today. The good news is both the Iranians and the Biden administration, including President Biden himself, have basically agreed they both want a compliance for compliance return to the deal. Both sides want the US, at least the Iranians want the US, of course, to lift sanctions again. The US would like, and the rest of the international community would like, Iran to go back to its nuclear commitments. Unfortunately, right now, for the first year, Iran kind of exercised strategic patience. But since the withdrawal, and especially over the past year and running up to the new administration, Iran has really ramped up its nuclear activities to extremely worrying levels, where their breakout time, I don't want to get into nuclear technicalities, but we're getting to the point we were before 2015, where they're dangerously close, just months away from the ability to create enough fissile material to weaponize their program. So we're kind of in an urgent state again. Most of the steps are reversible. So the good news, the US can actually, the Biden administration can lift through executive order a lot of the sanctions that were reimposed. It's tricky. There's the Trump administration really piled on what many call a wall of sanctions, but many sanctions that went well beyond just the nuclear program to human rights issues, to terrorism. All of those sanctions had been there, by the way, even with the JCPOA. But it complicates the unraveling, right? So there are going to be some issues about which sanctions have to be lifted. The Iranian return to the program is more straightforward. They'll have to reduce their enrichment again, send out some of it out of the country. There'll be some questions about R&D. But my assessment is these are process issues. The big issue is about sequencing, but with creative diplomacy and political will, it's doable. Maybe not as easy as the Paris Agreement, stroke of a pen, because we're going to need a new agreement of how the compliance for compliance arrangement will work, but it's doable.
Dalia, there's often, and you mentioned it, I think earlier, there is a sort of proximal myopia in the United States that we only see our own internal politics affecting these things. Can you talk a little bit about what Iranian politics are like in regards to the JCPOA, and also what the upcoming elections in June might hold for this agreement?
Yeah, I think this is where the biggest, challenges to reviving the agreement and U.S. engagement in the agreement. And without our full return, the JCPOA has already been hanging on a thread because if the Iranians don't get the sanctions relief, we see where they're headed with their nuclear program. So it's really critical. But I think the obstacles are really about mindset and politics. And on the Iranian side, I think what we maybe don't appreciate enough is that, there's a mindset in the US and some Western quarters that, we have all the leverage now, right? We've been piling these sanctions on. The Iranians are going to be desperate for this relief between, economic downturn of oil, oil prices plunging, the pandemic, kind of perfect storm that's affecting the entire region. But the combination of all of that with the sanctions have been devastating for the Iranian economy. They're really in desperate economic straits. So there's this feeling that the Iranians will be so desperate, we have all the leverage. So before we go back to the agreement, let's get better terms now. And the Iranians are saying, and you hear this through conversations and public messaging now, we may not be as desperate as you think. We have other workarounds. We've been expanding our relationship with China. We've still managed to export our oil. We've been developing a non-oil economy. We don't trust you, right? The experience, we're not just starting from the point we were in 2015. There is now a legacy of mistrust. The Iranians look at the US pull out and they say, how can we trust you in the future? They're kind of maybe approaching this with what I call in the piece, and I've heard some Iranians use this term kind of maximum caution, because they don't know if the US will deliver or the Europeans. The Iranians were quite frustrated with actually the European response to the US withdrawal. They thought the Europeans were appeasing Trump. They were not at the end of the day able to get their businesses to keep investing in Iran because of the power of the US dollar. It was quite effective. So, and then you mentioned the election. Iran has its politics of its own. It has an upcoming presidential election in June of this year. And President Rouhani and his kind of more pragmatic camp, along with Zarif, they're under fire because the deal did not deliver within Iran itself, right? It didn't deliver the economic relief. Even before the US reimposed sanctions, they weren't getting as much benefit as they had hoped. Then on top of it, there was the visa ban that's been lifted, which is good news, but there's been a lot of disgruntlement with this deal. And so the view is it's possible that more hardline elements of the country will not want to give Rouhani and his camp kind of a boost with showing that diplomacy worked, that his way of doing things was the right way to do things. And so it's not to say the hardliners couldn't strike an agreement later. They can, because they do want this relief, but they may not be in a hurry. So I think that's part of the politics that we're seeing on both sides. And in the US side, lifting sanctions is never politically popular.
A final thought, Dalia. The subtitle of your piece, Can Revival of the Nuclear Deal Spark a New Regional Security Dialogue? Describe to us what that would look like.
Well, I think what is a potential opportunity, and we know the region, and particularly our partners in Israel and Saudi Arabia, are not enthusiastic about a US return. They've been very vocal about it. I think there's reason to believe the Israelis may be even more opposed to this agreement or a US return than they were in 2015, even though there is a better relationship, I think, between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But despite that regional opposition, I think there is an understanding that the nuclear issue is not enough. It's the first step. You need to contain this nuclear program. You need a longer and stronger agreement, as the Biden officials say. But you need to focus on the non-nuclear issues. That's really of high concern for Iran's neighbors, for US interests, frankly, especially missile development, proxy warfare. These conflicts, as I said, have spilled over from the region. They're fueling extremism and crises that have global impact. So I think there may, now what you're seeing, and it's not a new concept, the idea of a regional forum for dialogue, but there's growing recognition and momentum that the Middle East is the only region of the world that doesn't have a place for all actors to engage in dialogue on issues of mutual concern. They're not going to solve them, but you can de-escalate conflicts in areas like Yemen and have conversations between the Iranians and their Gulf Arab neighbors. You can deal with non-border issues like public health, pandemics, climate change, and then kind of broader security issues like maritime security and cross-border activity of terrorist groups and the like. And there is, I think you're seeing initiatives from the Gulf, from Russia, from Iran, even from some members of this incoming administration, that really are recognizing we need somewhere to talk about these issues. And so I'm somewhat optimistic. It's not going to happen overnight. The US doesn't have the bandwidth to convene this kind of thing without partners. It's not the world of the post-Gulf War 1991 and a big Madrid conference. But I think there is a political will and interest in this. So I'm hoping that will be kind of the silver lining and that we can, leverage a potential return of the deal to something bigger.
No, I like a little optimism. We could all use it, right? I'll take the silver lining and run. Dalia, Dassa, Kaye, thank you very much for a terrific piece in the WQ and for expanding on your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.
I'm going to, as always, you got to give the final word to the editor. So, Richard, people, here's, it's not the best news necessarily about the WQ, but it certainly is good news that the subscription rates are terrific. Tell people how they can read the WQ and subscribe to it.
Well, it's always accessible at wilsonquarterly.com, but we do have a subscription model. It's a subscription model which we're hoping it doesn't cost anything. It's absolutely free, but we're hoping that it lets us get the WQ to you directly through your email. And we also have started a monthly WQ dispatches in months that we don't publish. So you'll be getting a lot of you'll be getting updates. We'll be more in touch. We'll just, the WQ will be a little bit more a part of your life. So you can go to our website, and there is a subscribe button right in the hamburger menu at the top left of the site. And we encourage you to do it. You will be the first to get the WQ when we publish, and you'll also be getting a monthly update that looks at what our authors are up to, what we're reading, what we're looking at.
Great. Thank you very much. Is it too early to ask for a preview of the next issue?
We are actually embarked upon a very major issue on public health in a time of pandemic. And we've already been conducting interviews for this issue. So we're really excited about what we're going to be able to do, and to bring a lot of the resources of the Wilson Center. We were named the top regional center think tank today again. And I think that we have just such an amazing treasure trove of information about different corners of the world. And this pandemic has reached every corner of this world. So we'll be bringing a lot of that to bear on our next issue.
Excellent. Thanks again, Richard, for joining us. Thanks to
Thank
Dalia
you.
and to Alasdair as well. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. And while you're at it, that you'll subscribe to the WQ. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.